real significance of this first summit is that it is happening
It's
at
also
all.
the kind of music that's all over the internet in MP3 format.
There are also healthcare workers and civil servants here angry about budget cuts and worried about their
Organizers
jobs.
of today's protests say it's obvious Harris hasn't gotten the message.
Chill, freezing genetically modified foods out of Europe could be
The
setting
land
in
giveaway
here.
grows. It's become an issue raised at international summits.
Hello, I'm Knowlton Nash. In this edition of News and Review, in Quebec City, the Summit of the Americas was played out on two vastly different planes. Behind fences and police protection, the leaders of 34 countries talked about a free trade pact. But on the streets, thousands of protesters demonstrated against the process and against increasing globalization. Sometimes the demonstrations were peaceful and sometimes violent. Trade relations between Canada and the United States reached another crisis this spring over the export of Canadian softwood to the United States. Canada is trying to ward off American demands that large duties be imposed on Canadian lumber. A United States spy plane flying off the coast of China collides with a Chinese Air Force jet. It is forced to land in China, setting off a diplomatic and propaganda incident between the two countries. And almost 50 years after they were taken from their homes and parents and forced into the British Columbia-run residential school, 49 Doukhobors are suing for compensation. We look back at a controversial episode in Canadian history. It was with a sense of both expectation and dread that the world turned its eyes toward Quebec City in late April of 2001. The city was hosting what's known as the Summit of the Americas, a gathering of leaders from 34 countries throughout North, Central, and South America. Their goal, to begin talks on creating the world's largest free trade zone, stretching from the Arctic to Argentina. One common marketplace for 800 million people. Only communist Cuba would be excluded. The ultimate idea, to allow economics to lead the way to a better life for all. But it wasn't just government leaders heading for Quebec. Thousands of protesters were also gathering. People who felt trade agreements had been giving too much power to corporations, sacrificing things like human rights, health care, and the environment. Given such opposite views and a trend for violent confrontation in recent years, it was no surprise what happened next. The whole thing played out like some kind of sporting event. Television networks carrying live play-by-play as protesters and police clashed in a preordained arena mainly around a chain-link fence. The immediate focus of the protesters' energy and their rage was that hated fence. It was built in the weeks leading up to the summit, 4 meters tall and 4 kilometers long. It wrapped whole neighborhoods of the city in a tight cocoon. For many in Quebec, it said it all. A sinister curtain closed so that ordinary citizens could not see what their governments were up to. Along with the fence, there were upwards of 6,000 police. And here's what all that security was protecting. Inside, the official opening of the summit was underway. The visiting leaders greeted by Jean and Aline Chrétien. They were getting ready to begin their talks on creating a free trade area of the Americas. But first, they were asked what they thought of the protesters.
If they're protesting because of free trade, I would say I disagree. I think trade is very important for this hemisphere. Trade not only helps spread prosperity, but trade helps spread freedom.
Violence and provocation is unacceptable in a democracy. The type of behavior that we have seen outside this afternoon by small groups of extremists is contrary to the democratic principle we all hold dear.
This type of behavior, as the Prime Minister put it, was just the latest demonstration of a growing phenomenon on the world scene. One that began in earnest with the battle in Seattle. The city of Seattle, Washington was hosting a meeting of the World Trade Organization in late November of 1999. But also on hand were thousands of protesters who came from all over and took to the streets. There were scenes of terrible violence and vandalism. A state of emergency was declared. The protesters, though, succeeded in disrupting the meeting and the talks collapsed. Events like this began dogging international meetings around the world.
This is a peaceful protest.
It had become an industry of sorts, with classes and training camps on how to protest properly, such as this one in the run-up to Quebec City.
The thumb joint, the wrist joint, disorienting your opponent. So the grab over the face, like that, going for pressure points, leverage points, behind the jaw here. It can be highly painful.
The police, who were to guard Quebec City, made preparations of their own, steeling themselves for the inevitable confrontation. But where was all that anger coming from? And what is this thing called globalization? In simple terms, globalization is about removing barriers between countries, particularly trade barriers. And it has some lofty goals, like spreading democracy and prosperity around the world. Its critics, though, worry that the process favors corporate profits over people, and they don't like such important decisions being made behind closed doors. Here in Canada, the debate over free trade is nothing new. The CBC's Keith Bogue takes a closer look at the issues and the arguments.
This is a good deal.
This is not a trade deal.
Betrayal of Canadian history. It's an act of faith in Canada.
A satellite of the United States.
Remember the great free trade debates of the 1988 election?
Let the people decide.
And Mr. Mulroney said if we didn't get exempted, we would have to pull out, or he would pull out.
That was when Maud Barlow first laid down the markers that continue to define her quarrel with trade agreements and those who negotiate them.
Under this deal, no future government can do anything that costs corporate America its ability to make money in Canada.
12 years later, that remains her core belief.
What's changed since then? You were saying some things then that you're still saying now.
Well, one of the big things that's changed is that I guess we saw it more in terms of Canadian nationalism, Canada versus the U.S., and that's sure not our analysis anymore. We see it more in terms of democracy, and rather than national sovereignty, we really define the issue as more one of political sovereignty of the people, right? The corporations have gone very global, the trade agreements have gone global, and our movement's gone global.
On this panel, put together by the CBC radio program This Morning, Barlow finds herself squaring off with some old foes from the 80s. Sylvie Austrie, economist, former trade negotiator, and blunt skeptic when it comes to bold claims either for or against the impact of trade deals.
I think that if you want to have these kinds of debates, don't take this thing that this is exactly it. Everything that's wrong with the world is due to trade.
All right. At microphone number one.
Her core belief is not that trade creates economic growth, but that trade is essential to building communities. It creates mutual interests.
We've got to think about ways in which we can bridge the North-South divide, not only by opening our markets to these countries, but also by recognizing that they need enormous technical and monetary assistance in building their basic infrastructure. The northern countries, the rich countries, had better face the fact that if they don't deal with this yawning North-South divide and the growing marginalization of the poor countries, that I don't know what the outcome is going to be. It's not going to be very pleasant.
These people did not come here in droves to stop governments from agreeing to support the fundamentals of democracy, nor because they're opposed to other items on the summit agenda, such as shutting down the drug trade or protecting the environment. Why would they? They likely agree those are important and worthwhile issues. No, they are here because they warily believe that no matter what the official agenda says, the fact is, for most countries, most of the time, the hot topic at international meetings is trade. Anyone paying attention over the last 10 years would have to say that's a reasonable conclusion.
So governments themselves have put their energy and their resources and privileged that part of the agenda. For Canadian foreign policy, for a long time now, dating back to the Mulroney government, the leading plank of our foreign policy has been trade policy. Trade promotion, trade negotiation, signing trade agreements, and exporting and doubling our exports to whichever part of the world. And that is a communications failure on the part of the federal government, that the foreign minister has not been out there from the beginning hammering home on all the real challenges this region faces, whether it's the drug problem, corruption, tax evasion, the plight of migrant workers.
And I think that the FTAA should be a kind of laboratory.
Sylvia Austree's point is that it's all connected. Social and democratic development, she believes, grow from a sense of community. And that sense of community begins with economic integration.
This hemisphere shares a common heritage, which is a European heritage. So if you dig deep enough, you are sharing a common heritage. I don't understand why it developed so differently. I mean, Argentina has more resources and stuff than we. So there were other issues about the colonial heritage. And I think trade is only one means of building up, and you have to be patient, it has to be over time, an integration in which you can begin to say we share certain norms and values.
Maud Barlow arrived Tuesday. Something about the cool air of Quebec City triggered a memory.
Just a few days in Seattle before everything exploded, and there's just this kind of eerie quiet, like the police are starting to get on the buildings and you hear the helicopters.
One of the criticisms she and those on her side of the argument often face is that their opposition to free trade in the Southern Hemisphere actually hurts the very people they profess to want to help. The argument goes that closer economic ties encourage the spread of democracy and the protection of human rights. Barlow says she actually agrees with that idea.
I absolutely agree that an incentive to opening up democracies and language around violence and so on would be much easier if we were also economically working toward a fair trade system. But this is not about trade. The thing I want to say most strongly, this is about telling governments what they can no longer do to stop corporations from doing what they want in their borders. Corporations of the Americas want the lowest possible level playing field. They call it a level playing field, but they don't mean up here. They mean way down there. They don't want to bump into different environmental systems or labor standards or health and safety standards as they cross borders. And so for them, they want an agreement that basically gives corporate rights before human rights, before political rights, and even before democracy.
Again, what motivates these people is a belief that trade agreements are giving huge powers to corporations, and they are encouraged in that belief by their experience. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, contains something called Chapter 11. Chapter 11 reflects an American idea of property rights that allows corporations to sue foreign governments if their public policies hurt private investments.
The most egregious piece of that NAFTA pie is Chapter 11, which allowed for the first time corporations to bypass their own governments and sue the governments of other countries. That has been so abused, as we all know now, that even the Canadian government is saying, my God, how did we ever sign this thing? What you may not know is that it's now in 1,720 bilateral investment treaties around the world, so it's not just in NAFTA anymore, and it was the heart of what they wanted to put into the multilateral agreement on investment.
Is Maud right about Chapter 11, though? And I ask
Yes.
because she is.
I agree with her. I think it was a great mistake.
Now, she is able to use that, though, and leverage that mistake. Into
And that's
the,
one of the reasons it was a great mistake.
Austria is the first to say that governments can never be sure of all the implications of the decisions they make and the agreements they sign.
In my 25 years in government, there's one law, there's several, but one law that reigns supreme, that is the law of unexpected consequences. Absolutely true.
Apart from the protests in Quebec City, there were actually two summits going on, the official one and another called the People's Summit. Several thousand anti-globalization activists met to present a rebuttal to the official summit's agenda.
And any trade agreement that is not part of the solution to that problem is part of the problem.
Otra América es posible.
For 3 days, they discussed democracy, the environment, and social issues. And they believed they had made a difference.
The People's Summit has achieved a degree of visibility and credibility that is unprecedented.
There was also talk of the protests, many arguing that the violence, as always, was the work of a few, and that the majority demonstrated peacefully and with success.
People in these buildings are hearing us, and those buildings are hearing us, and together, it's going to have to happen.
As for the official summit, it ended, according to Prime Minister Chrétien, with the beginning of a new era. The 34 leaders pledging to work toward a huge new free trade zone with democracy at the heart of it. Eric Sorensen had that story.
For the 34 leaders of the Western Hemisphere, the Summit of the Americas, the formal summit, was a success. They've agreed to work together to combat organized crime, bridge the digital divide, and investigate the political problems in Haiti. But they believe the biggest achievement here was a declaration linking democracy to free trade.
We want to make sure that each citizen has an equal opportunity to live in dignity.
In the Quebec City Declaration, the 34 countries agreed to a democracy clause making free elections and other democratic practices an essential condition for free trade. And they agreed to create the Free Trade Area of the Americas by 2005.
Para reafirmar los valores de la democracia,
tying democratic principles to trade. That, says Argentina's President Fernando de la Rúa, will make this the century of the Americas.
el siglo de las Américas.
The summit succeeded in one other way, by simply taking place while surrounded by mayhem. Organizers say it should be clear now why such a large area was sealed off, why the fence, why all the police. In the end, Jean Chrétien says what happened inside will win over more Canadians than what happened outside the fence.
Look at the clouds that we have developed together at this time to make sure that democracy will remain in the Americas.
And he had a message for those who screamed for democracy while destroying property.
In a democracy, you have the right to speak, but you have to respect the law.
President de la Rúa, the host of the next summit in Argentina, apologized to Canada for any problems the 33 leaders caused with their visit here. Now he says they have to go home to sell free trade to their own people, adding that he hopes a wall won't be required at the 2005 Summit of the Americas.
Canada and the United States have fought over lumber many times over the years, and this spring they got ready to rumble once again, with the U.S. throwing the first punch in a new round in the same old dispute. It's about trade in softwoods such as pine and spruce. That's the kind of wood used to build houses. 80% of Canadian softwood, $11 billion worth a year, is exported. The biggest customer by far is Canada's biggest trading partner, the United States. The fight over lumber is older than Canada itself. Back in 1853, 14 years before Confederation, there was a dispute with the United States over trading wood. During the harsh economic times of the 1930s, the U.S. put duties on Canadian lumber for the first time. A duty means a fee is charged when the wood crosses the border. In the 1960s, the Americans tried for more duties. That failed. But in the 1980s, the trade fight turned into a trade war. 3 more times the U.S. tried unsuccessfully to put duties on Canadian lumber. Finally, in 1996, peace with a new settlement.
The agreement puts an end to a 15-year lumber trade war between the U.S. and Canada that's often been costly and disruptive for the Canadian forest industry. The U.S. has always claimed that Canada's lumber is unfairly subsidized. It was threatening to impose punishing new duties on Canadian exports worth $8 billion. Now, says Trade Minister Art Eggleton, that won't happen, and the 100,000 Canadian jobs that depend on lumber exports are safe.
The United States is making an unprecedented commitment not to launch any trade actions against Canadian softwood lumber during the next 5 years.
In return, Canada has agreed to measures to restrain the rapid growth of lumber exports to the U.S. by imposing taxes on about 10% of those shipments. Those taxes, adding up to about $175 million, will be paid by the industry and turned over to the 4 major lumber-producing provinces: BC, Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec.
It's the best deal in a bad situation. I say a bad situation because we don't have the protection under NAFTA that we would prefer to have.
We consider this a very good compromise. From an industry standpoint, we think it's a very significant achievement.
Not surprisingly, U.S. government officials are putting a different spin on the agreement. They're claiming that Canada is now committed to reducing its lumber exports, despite the fact the agreement says nothing about reducing the current Canadian share of the U.S. lumber market.
That was spring 1996. 5 years later, this spring, the agreement ran out. That might have raised the hopes of people in Canada's lumber industry. People who thought they'd get the same kind of free trade with the Americans that other Canadian businesses now take for granted. But it soon became clear that yet another fight was brewing. This is Quebec lumber being used to build American houses. Just some of the Canadian wood that some Americans are so angry about.
Well, U.S. mills are going out of business and workers are losing their livelihoods.
We have to stop the subsidizing practices in Canada and get a fair and balanced agreement.
Subsidizing practices. That was the American senator's accusation. It's the main part of this fight, and it's a pretty complicated concept. The U.S. says Canadian governments are giving Canadian lumber producers subsidies, not giving them money exactly, but helping them financially in another way. Most of the trees cut in Canada are on land owned by the federal or provincial governments. Crown land, it's called. Canadian provinces work out deals with companies giving them the right to cut the trees. And in return, the companies pay a fee. It's called stumpage. And the Americans say the stumpage fees are way too low.
Who are the losers? We think the Canadian taxpayers are getting ripped off. You're selling your natural resource for pennies on the dollar.
A lot of the timberland in the States is on private land. The timber is sold at auctions. The U.S. lumber companies say that means they pay a lot more for their timber than Canadian companies. The Americans say what the Canadians get with their low stumpage rates amounts to a $5 billion government handout. Also, they're accusing Canada of dumping, selling wood cheaply in the U.S. at below what it costs to produce in the first place. Believe it or not, the Canadian lumber industry does have some support in the U.S. from American home builders who want free trade in softwood to meet demands for affordable housing.
The United States is totally incapable of providing the demand in the U.S. for softwood lumber. We need Canada, and to continue with the restrictive trade agreement is farcical.
Now, before we get any further, it's important to mention some key differences in the way things work among Canadian lumber producers. British Columbia produces 60% of Canada's softwood, but it was restricted by the 1996 lumber deal by a quota on how much lumber it could sell to the U.S. In Atlantic Canada, a different story. 3/4 of the timberland is in private hands, most of it owned by the powerful Irving family. Its lumber hasn't faced the same restrictions going south as BC would, and that made for a split on the Canadian side as the end of the 1996 agreement approached.
British Columbia lumber. New Brunswick lumber. Both high-quality wood, but with one important distinction. Most New Brunswick timber comes from private property. It's exempt from quotas, and business to the U.S. is booming. BC, though, is watching its share of the U.S. market fall. That's because there is a quota on how much its forest companies can sell to the U.S. The quota meets American concerns that BC unfairly subsidizes exports by charging low fees to cut on Crown land. Now, as a new confrontation looms with the U.S., Canadian lumber lobbyists from East and West are turning on each other.
More power to the Maritimes. They managed to get an exemption last time. I think that the plain and simple truth is that we're facing anti-dumping because of the Maritimes.
Diana Blencorn of the Maritime Lumber Bureau didn't take that lying down.
We are too small to affect the selling price of lumber.
Now, Western lobbyists are in Ottawa pushing for a new agreement that would cover all Canadian lumber going to the U.S.
Why should we in British Columbia
take our #1 industry and push it down the chute in the interest of a bunch of special deals for other regions.
Atlantic officials have stopped short of suggesting BC is subsidizing its lumber, but make it clear Atlantic Canada is not.
We are market-based in Atlantic Canada.
And Atlantic Canada is telling Ottawa it wants to keep the deal it has now.
There has never been a one-size-fits-all solution in softwood lumber wars in Canada since 1981.
Should there be now?
No, there should not be. There is not a one-size-fits-all operating circumstances in Canada.
Ottawa just wants the squabbling to stop.
I do not like it when Atlantic representatives say that BC does this, and I don't like it when BC people say that Atlantic should do that. I am telling you that we should work as a Team Canada. Team Canada, softwood lumber.
Part of the American argument is that cheap Canadian wood is the reason that 100 lumber mills in the U.S. have closed either temporarily or permanently. Here's the story of one of those mills in Georgia.
The people of Thomasville, Georgia, have stopped counting how often it comes. They just know it does. It's that train, the one carrying the most galling of cargoes. Canadian softwood lumber, Newfoundland, Quebec, British Columbia's best. Each plank more salt in the very deep wound of Bob Balfour.
Well, it doesn't feel very good to see the tracks filled with Canadian lumber. We know it's overwhelming the country.
In that rail yard shadow, 3 generations of Bob Balfours have cut southern pine here. But the mill's been silent for months. No match, the argument goes, for Canada.
We know it's taking our markets away from us. They can undersell southern yellow pine all over the United States. There's no way that we can compete with Canada.
Here, in the land of the southern pine, that's a little hard to take. Georgia is the largest lumber products manufacturer in the entire United States, but that doesn't mean its own southern pine rules this place. Canadian softwood, this lumber right here, now takes 1/3 of the market. Ideal for the construction industry, Canadian softwood is lighter, easier to pound nails into, cheaper, and that's always frustrated the U.S. mill owners. Decades of trade battles were supposed to end with a deal negotiated in 1996 that restricts the export of Canadian softwood lumber. U.S. mill owners say it didn't protect them enough. Point out that 3 major Georgia mills have closed in the last year. Many more, like Metcalf Lumber, are on the brink. Limping along, the owner says, in hope that when the current agreement ends on March 31st, something stricter will replace it. Canadians want just the opposite, complete free trade in softwood. Canadian mills are suffering too, but there's a perception here that Canada has an unbeatable edge. Partly because of the low Canadian dollar, partly because many Canadian mills are more modern, more efficient. But the most unfair advantage, say the Americans, is how little Canadians pay for timber.
I'm telling you, the lumber industry in the United States is in dire straits. I mean, this is the worst. I've been in it 40 years, and I've never seen it like this. I mean, so what if we all go broke? Y'all take over. You sell all the lumber.
Complex trade issues that deep in the southern woods boil down to one clear reality.
It's really hurt our business. You know, I don't have any problem with them shipping it in here, but they should tax it accordingly.
An entire industry on the edge, convinced Canada is driving it into oblivion.
There are some powerful Americans determined to save that industry. On April 2nd, 2001, they made their big move. The U.S. lumber industry asked the administration of President George W. Bush to take action against Canada, in effect, to start another trade war.
Several all-nighters in a Washington law firm, and here it is. The case against Canada, delivered this morning to the U.S. Department of Commerce.
The big boxes are the countervailing duty petitions, and the small boxes are the anti-dumping duty petitions.
Briefs calling for a penalty of up to 78%. That could be as much as $8 billion to be imposed on Canada for what the U.S. lumber industry says amounts to years of cheating.
Our message to the Canadians is this simple. Do not subsidize, stop the dumping, do not surge, or our action will be, and should be, swift and severe.
Now, the next step is all about wading through the volumes of evidence, and the best guess is that it will be at least late fall before there's a final decision about whether Canada will be forced to hand over billions in penalties.
Trade Minister Pierre Pettigrew says the American producers are trying unfairly to protect their market.
This trade action is not about subsidies for our industry. It's about protectionism.
Here's another thing Pettigrew says it's about.
We are productive because we're darn good. We're productive because we have invested in modernizing our equipment and not because we are subsidizing.
On April 1st, the curtain was pulled back on a shadowy, high-stakes game of cat and mouse. Two planes collided high in the sky off China. One was a U.S. spy plane, the other a Chinese fighter jet. The jet crashed into the sea. The Chinese pilot was killed. The U.S. plane barely made it to Chinese territory, where it made an unauthorized landing. It was a major international incident, and two powerful nations who have long been suspicious of each other went on a crisis footing. CBC reporter David Halton has the beginning of our story.
The collision involved an EP-3, a U.S. Navy spy plane. With a crew of 24 aboard, the aircraft was crammed with electronic eavesdropping equipment. U.S. officials say the plane was in international airspace over the South China Sea when its wing was clipped by one of two Chinese F-8 fighters pursuing it. The collision forced the U.S. aircraft to make an emergency landing on the Chinese island of Hainan. China says its fighter crashed and its pilot is missing. Chinese TV quickly blamed the collision on the Americans. The U.S. is totally responsible, said this news announcer. But the Pentagon blamed the Chinese.
The faster, more maneuverable aircraft has the obligation to stay out of the way of the slower aircraft. Our aircraft fly routinely straight and level. It's pretty obvious as to who bumped into whom.
But Admiral Blair said he didn't think the ramming was deliberate.
I would say it's an accident. It's not a normal practice to play bumper cars in the air. It's too dangerous for everybody.
But U.S. officials were not allowed anywhere near the crew or the plane.
Failure of the Chinese government to react promptly to our request is inconsistent with standard diplomatic practice and with the expressed desire of both our countries for better relations.
For their part, the Chinese accused the U.S. crew of deliberately causing the crash. It demanded a full apology, but what it got instead was tough words.
This accident has the potential of undermining our hopes for a fruitful and productive relationship between our two countries.
This was, in a sense, a preliminary to war.
Retired U.S. Admiral Jean Larocque served in the U.S. military for more than 30 years.
There is an increasing tension growing between the United States and China. In a sense, it's almost as if this present administration is trying to pick a fight, not only with the Chinese, but we're being very testy and abrasive with Russia. So I think this may be an eye-opener for the administration about the need to get along with these other countries.
But both sides seem to be digging in. With each day, a solution to the crisis seemed to fade further away. For China, it was a matter of national pride. The U.S. was snooping around its doorstep, listening in on its conversations, and one of its pilots was dead. It had been wronged. The U.S., however, said it had done nothing wrong, and the Chinese were now holding 24 of its service people, in effect, hostage. But how did this happen in the first place? Why were the two countries playing that dangerous game 4 miles high in the sky? Reporter Brian Stewart takes a closer look at that.
The incident over a U.S. surveillance aircraft seemed to flare out of nowhere. But it dramatically exposes a hidden intelligence war between the U.S. and China that has been escalating for years. the U.S. has been urgently trying to update its intelligence file on China's military, both nuclear and conventional. One priority concern, growing Chinese sea power. In recent years, China has rattled Asian countries by sending impressive new surface ships, especially missile destroyers, on ever more distant exercises, into waters around disputed Taiwan, and even close to South Korea and Japan. And U.S. intelligence is increasingly concerned about sophisticated new submarines, capable of firing cruise missiles with nuclear warheads. As for China, it is just as determined to hide its new naval secrets.
There's a whole new panoply of quality to the armed forces of China, not just the quantity they used to rely on. So for the Americans, it's very important to get that information, and of course they pass it on to their allies, the South Koreans, the Japanese, and the Taiwanese.
Paul Beaver is a senior military expert with the influential Jane's Defense Weekly in London. He says the world is seeing the birth of a new military reality.
For so long, the Japanese and the Americans between them have been masters of the sea in the area. Now China is disputing that. It's got new submarines, new destroyers. It'll soon have an aircraft carrier. All of those things mean that it is challenging the, if you like, the security balance that there's been in the region for the last 50 years. And it really is a concern to the Americans.
The long-term concern is power potential. A much stronger Chinese Navy could directly threaten to blockade Taiwan in order to return it to China. It could also threaten to close the sea lanes of the South China Sea that are so vital to Japan and South Korea. In either case, a response by the large U.S. Pacific Fleet would then threaten a profoundly dangerous showdown.
All of these things make China look as if it is going to be a potential rival, if not a threat, in the next decade. In fact, the Japanese Defense White Paper talks about the rivalry, and it really has identified China as being the future potential threat to the livelihood of Japan. All of that, because of America and its relationship with Japan, means that it's a rival to America as well. So everybody now looks in this part of the world towards China as the growing power.
Through China's gaze, however, everything looks very different. It feels historically affronted by that all-powerful U.S. Pacific Fleet, along with the increasing surveillance flights. And America's apparent intention to sell still more sophisticated weapons to Taiwan is felt as both an insult and a threat.
Let me say finally that this is a very important relationship. Good relationship between us is in the interest of our two peoples and in the interest of the people of the world. And we will try our best to have improved relations with the United States. On the other hand, China is a sovereign country. We have our own dignity. So we have to safeguard our own sovereignty and dignity. And this issue has been caused not by the Chinese side, but by the American side. So we hope that the American side will adopt the right approach.
But how do you find that right approach? There was a lot to consider, a lot at stake. Not just military rivalries, but trade realities. Just a generation ago, these two countries weren't on speaking terms. They were so suspicious of each other that they didn't even have diplomatic relations. That started to change in 1972 when the U.S. President Richard Nixon visited China. Full diplomatic relations were established on New Year's Day in 1979. But then in 1989, this happened. Chinese troops crushed pro-democracy protests in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. It's not known for sure, but it's believed that hundreds of people were killed. China found itself isolated once again. But even with that, U.S. officials were anxious not to sever ties altogether. That's largely because of China's sheer size. It's the most populous country on the planet. 1.3 billion people live there, 1/4 of the world's population. It's expected to be a leading economic power in this new century. China sold the Americans more than $100 billion worth of goods last year, and U.S. companies have invested over $25 billion in China in the last decade. That trade reality was a factor in everything that happened in the crisis over the spy plane. Somehow, the U.S. wanted to find a way to get its people back without jeopardizing its relationship with China. It was time for some serious diplomacy.
We've had the posturing, we've had the statements of principle, they don't help. China demanding an apology, we demanding the return of the 24 crewmen. They saying we violated the airspace, we saying they caused the crash. If you get into this sort of public diplomacy, I can tell you, not much gets done.
I regret that a Chinese pilot is missing, and I regret one of their airplanes is lost.
For Chinese officials, that statement was a step in the right direction. But the missing Chinese pilot had become a hero. Regret wasn't quite enough.
We are making progress. We are negotiating and working on the release of the air crew.
The end came on day 11. Here's the CBC's Adrian Arsenault on what sealed the deal.
On that charter jet are the 24 crew members of the spy plane, leaving Hainan, China. This is a plane powered by diplomacy. That the waiting is almost over is news President Bush wanted to deliver himself early this morning.
This has been a difficult situation for both our countries. I know the American people join me in expressing sorrow for the loss of life of a Chinese pilot. Our prayers are with his wife and his child.
Searching for the right tone to the end. White House officials say they've been working with words for a week, angling for the combination that would satisfy the Chinese. Overnight, on the fourth draft, the solution. A letter with two critical phrases. Please convey to the Chinese people and to the family of pilot Wang Wei that we are very sorry for their loss. And we are very sorry the entering of China's airspace and the landing did not have verbal clearance. Two very sorries, but according to the English translation at least, no embarrassing acceptance of blame.
And we did not do anything wrong, and therefore it was not possible to apologize.
President Bush basked in what his administration sees as a victory today.
It's such an honor to be the commander-in-chief of such wonderful people.
As he met with the parents of one of the crew members,
these good folks are patriots, as is their son.
Elsewhere across the nation, nervous families finally relaxed.
And thank you, President Bush, whatever it took.
When I answered the phone, he said, "Hey, Mom." I'm like, ah!
For now, the plane stays in Hainan. Its fate will be dealt with next week when Chinese and American officials meet to discuss exactly what happened over the South China Sea. But that's for the diplomats. This is a day for the families and the crew, who will return to what will no doubt be a hero's welcome. Adrian Arsenault, CBC News, Washington.
Announcing the decision, China claimed victory, giving the impression its demand for an apology had been fully met. The American government has said it is very sorry to the Chinese people and to the family of pilot Wang Wei, he says. But American Ambassador Joseph Prier, who signed the letter which broke the deadlock, felt like a winner too.
We're pretty happy with the state of affairs.
With face saved on both sides, says Professor Tao Wen-Zhao, the relationship between China and the United States won't suffer long-term damage.
After each crisis, after each trouble, China-US relations continue to develop, to improve.
The government's popularity has improved too. Nationalist feeling is strong in China, and many Chinese rally round when the government can claim it's standing up to foreign bullying. The Chinese government's done the right thing. It's very reasonable, says one man. The American apology wasn't enough, says another. I'm not satisfied. While some people grumble that China should have held out for more concessions, the leaders feel they've done well, keeping the American crew just long enough to boost their own popularity, but not so long as to invite retaliation. This incident may not be quite the propaganda success the Chinese leadership was hoping for, but it's certainly been an intelligence windfall. The American crew is leaving, their plane is staying in China.
By early May, the Chinese and Americans said they were closer to a deal on the release of the plane. There were indications that the U.S. would pay some money to the Chinese to get the plane back. Meanwhile, on May 7, for the first time since the incident, the U.S. flew a spy mission off the coast of China. 50 years ago, dozens of children in Canada were rounded up and taken away from their parents by the government of British Columbia. They were Doukhobors, whose beliefs and actions set them on a collision course with the authorities. The Doukhobors were pacifist farmers from Russia, many of whom fled to Canada from the rule of the Tsars in the 1880s. A very small minority belonged to an extremist sect called the Sons of Freedom. Their nude protests gained them notoriety, but it was their campaign of arson and bombings that made them infamous and dangerous. They torched buildings and blew up targets like hydro stations, shutting down industry. They were suspicious of all governments and refused to send their children to school, believing it would brainwash them into obeying the state. They insisted on their own schools. The government refused, and the scene was set for the tragedy to come. Dan Bjarnason has the story.
Peter Ellisoff and Nick Cadigan both were Doukhobor fathers of school-aged children as the crisis approached in the 1950s. All the parents wanted, says Ellisoff, was for the curriculum to reflect some of the Doukhobor values.
Doukhobors were never against ABC or 1, 2, 3. Doukhobors were never against education, never. But they were against the patriotism. Mostly it taught patriotism, and patriotism is followed by guns. And that is exactly.
In the early 1950s, the BC government came up with a brainstorm: take the kids from their homes and send them to government-run detention centers. However, even back then there were warnings that the government scheme was dangerous. In this 1952 internal memo, a consultant warned that removing the kids from their homes would cause emotional problems and result merely in the production of a neurotic Doukhobor for a non-educated one. But the newly elected Social Credit government ignored such warnings and in September 1953 made its move. To Shirley Schertzabitoff, that dreadful day remains a vivid scene in her mind.
I can still see the police coming up the road. It's never left me. We were all in the prayer tent, and as the police entered, my stepfather got hit on the head. I saw blood splatter, and we tore through the tent and into the bush.
Mike Varigan was 5 years old.
At that time, my whole world fell apart, and I learned about extreme fear. My auntie ended up being clubbed across the face and ended up in hospital. My mother was taken to jail. My sister was taken to be hidden in a different village, and I ended up with approximately half a dozen other kids hiding in the mountains, hiding from the RCMP.
148 were arrested that day. 28 would be sent to prison for 3 years for being nude. The Mounties also grabbed 104 children, the first inmates exiled to New Denver, a harrowing little universe devised especially for them. News that their children were being grabbed raced through the Doukhobor communities. Desperate families sent some kids off into mountain hideouts for months. Others were moved from farm to farm, hidden in cellars, in cupboards, in barns, in haystacks. Joe Schertzabitoff hid from the Mounties under some hay.
I can't understand how a human being could look for a kid with a pitchfork in a haystack. Because I was under the haystack, and I could hear the pitchfork hitting the boards. I don't know how to describe it.
Peter Ellisoff and Nick Cadigan, now in their 80s, still rage at the inhumanity that cost them their children.
I have to bring where's the Mountie that told me this? He said, Peter, if you was doing this to me, I'd have shot you. I still can't understand how a person, when he's got that feeling, what he expects me to do. You know, stand there, and I stood there, and I thought, dear God, there's got to be an end to this.
But it was only the beginning. At first glance, New Denver looked like a summer camp. But it was a no-nonsense institution where school-age children were kept away from their families against their will. There was no pretense this was a home, it was confinement. They saw their parents for 1 hour, twice a month. Life was regimented and regulated by strict rules enforced by tough matrons in starched uniforms. It brings back chilling memories.
My God, this, I don't like this. So my bed was over here somewhere, Lisa.
I think it was further down.
The children should have never happened. It was abuse of the worst kind. No, I was over here somewhere in the middle. I was. It's the lights are out. Go to bed. The lights are on. Get up. Nobody to even take your hand, to give you a hug.
We were first assigned numbers. These numbers were sewn onto our clothes and on our shoes. It also identified our area within the dorm. We had roll call every 2 hours. We would have a horn blow, and we would have to line up for roll call, and they would do a head count to make sure that all the kids were there. And in the meantime, the fence was patrolled by our CMP officers all the time.
Like you were in a penitentiary?
Just like a prison. It was a prison atmosphere.
Younger kids to like younger brothers?
Irene Shushnoff remembers the sobbing in the night.
Kids would have any idea what this was all about?
Sometimes you're just falling asleep and you hear somebody whimpering, and you wonder whether they're sick or whether they're just lonely or whatever. Then you hear somebody else whimpering, and before you know it, you're crying also, and it just goes on and on and on like a wave from one cubicle or from one bed to the next.
There were a few voices of dissent, privately warning about what was being done to the Doukhobor children. The province's social welfare branch said that removing the children from their homes was not about education, but was rather an attack on religious beliefs and culture. But publicly, school officials painted a picture of a make-believe world, a universe removed from the cruel reality.
The New Denver Dormitory is just like any other well-run private school in Canada. Children are clothed and fed and cared for, in this case at government expense. Corporal punishment is rarely used in the dormitory or in the school, and is probably less used in this school than in any other school in Canada.
I talked after lights out. And the matron caught me at it and she said, "You want to stay up?" She says, "I'll make sure you stay up all night." And she brought me to the bathroom and stood me in the shower stall. And whenever I'd start falling asleep, she'd come over and strap me.
Well, if you spoke Russian, you got strapped. I got strapped. I forgot to put my jeans in the laundry, and that was later on already. I got strapped. You got out of bed in the morning before the lights were on. You got strapped. For picking apples, we got strapped.
My dad worked in a sawmill in Silverton. On Wednesdays, he would go to New Denver to do some grocery shopping. There was one afternoon I did see him. I ran out, did get a hug from him. Next thing I know, there's the guard at the guard shack. Ran out, grabbed me, took me to the matron's office, and I was strapped for seeing my dad during non-visiting hours.
Parents protested outside the legislature and bombarded politicians with pleas to get their children back. They offered to compromise 4 public school days in exchange for 1 day dedicated to their Doukhobor teachings. For the government, in no mood to make a deal, compromise was not in the cards.
That's not what they had in their mind at all. No. The government want total disintegration.
If there is a single symbol of the sheer steel-fisted inhumanity of the place, it is the chain-link fence. A fence the children themselves were forced to build. A fence that kept the kids in and the parents out. If there was anything that mocked the claim that New Denver was other than a prison, it was that fence.
First of all, I couldn't believe it. And then I finally dawned on me how total it can get, how totally these people are going out to subdue, that you cannot even kiss your own child.
For Linda Essex and her sister Irene Shushnoff, those visits at the fence were heartbreaking.
Mom touching the fingers of the little kids because their fingers hung on the fence as they're trying to kiss. And everybody's trying to kiss each other really quickly so everybody gets a kiss. And then Mom patting the fingers.
Can you imagine mother trying to kiss a child through a fence? And the fence was this big? Can you imagine that? Can you imagine?
Finally, one summer's day in 1959, the Doukhobor children were taken to a bus stop and sent home. Their parents, unable to bear the pain any longer, after 7 years, had capitulated and agreed to send their kids to public schools.
Well, they wanted to destroy a type of a culture, didn't they? And they did it through children.
2 years ago, in the first whisper of justice, British Columbia's ombudsman condemned what had happened to the Doukhobor children and declared the government owes them an unqualified apology and restitution. But in the time since that report, the government has taken precisely no action. So today, a group of 49 of the New Denver alumni declared it's time and launched a class action suit. Lawyer Drew Schroeder.
The motive of the government was to bring the parents to heel. They took the children away and punished the children in order to punish the parents. That's what they did, and it's wrong today. It was wrong in 1950. It's always been wrong.
I don't care if the thing was paved in gold, and not all of it was bad, and not every matron was a whore. There was some that at least cared a bit. What happened was not right. It should be acknowledged to the Canadian people that what happened in this country to a group of innocent kids. We apologize for it, we acknowledge it, and we compensate for their loss of, if you can, for their loss of childhood.
Doukhobors came to this country fleeing repression and expecting to find a compassionate and tolerant haven. Instead, many lost their children. Desperate mothers pleaded then, how could this have happened? Today, those children are still waiting for an answer.
And that's all for News in Review. I'm Knowlton Nash, and I'll see you next fall.